Testing, testing. Good evening, Mill Valley. I'm Shane Curtin. You may recognize me from the circulation desk and elsewhere around the library. Tonight I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Matthew Walker, Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology at UC Berkeley and Director of its Sleep and Neuroimaging Laboratory. Dr. Walker earned his PhD in neuropsychology from the Medical Research Council in London and subsequently became a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. As a professor, he observed how academic pressures caused many of his students to fall behind in their sleep, often leading to erratic and irrational behavior. It's always been common knowledge that sleep is necessary for health and survival, but Matthew wanted to know more. He found that surprisingly little was understood about sleep. Why do we do it? What exactly occurs during it? Dr. Walker took it upon himself to bridge the gap between common knowledge and scientific fact. Today, his lab works with healthy and clinical populations to examine the impact of sleep on human health and disease. I didn't go to medical school, but I do know a lot about sleep deprivation. At some point during my freshman year of college, it became apparent to me that I could get by on very little sleep, so why not push the envelope? After all, I resented sleep. Life was finite, and I wasn't about to waste any of it in an unconscious state. So I made a lifestyle out of not sleeping. On a steady diet of about 3 hours a night, the boundaries of reality began to melt away. Author Chuck Palahniuk perfectly captured the essence of my experience in his novel Fight Club. With insomnia, he wrote, "You're never really asleep. You're never really awake. Nothing is real. Everything is far away. Everything is a copy of a copy of a copy." Like Palahniuk's beleaguered protagonist, I watched the world from a great distance. Sounds and sights underwent strange amplifications and distortions. Voices spoke to me out of nowhere. Figures lingered at the corner of my vision, only to disappear when I whirled to confront them. This wasn't the effect I've been going for, but I liked it. At times, the biological mechanism would take over. I would take 1,000 micro-naps, waking up in the middle of class or in conversations, or at the end of the line on the bus. I would lay down in bed for a quick rest and open my eyes 24 hours later in a state of utter confusion. But this erratic schedule left me feeling worse than if I hadn't slept at all. My moods were characterized by extremes, alternating between detached serenity, severe anxiety, depression, and paranoia. My symptoms were some of those associated with schizophrenia and manic depression, but I suffered from neither. I just hadn't slept. What began as a way to get the most out of life had backfired horrendously, but I'd also become addicted to it, and like an addict, I was somehow not deterred by its enormous physical and mental costs. A couple of years later, I had returned to the world of the living. Of course, I still like to stay up late, but I do eventually go to bed. For many, even those without sleep disorders, a good night's sleep is no longer the norm. Some deliberately shun it, as I did, considering it a waste of valuable time. Others treat it as a luxury, to be enjoyed when time permits. From my experience, I know that sleep is the only thing we have standing between us and complete insanity. Those of us who can get it should never take it for granted. Not only does sleep replenish our bodies and bolster memory and creativity, it is emotionally restorative, stripping away the psychological residue of negative experience. It is, to quote Dr. Walker, a form of overnight therapy. Miss too many sessions and life starts to fall apart. Dr. Walker's research goes beyond the mere understanding of memory and emotion. His findings have far-reaching implications for treating memory loss, post-traumatic stress, and mental illnesses of all kinds. He has received numerous awards from organizations, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. He is a Kavli Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, has published over 80 scientific articles, and is at work on his first popular book, Why We Sleep, to be published in 2017. He has been featured on numerous television and radio outlets, including CBS, National Geographic, Nova Science, and the BBC. I would like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Foundation for making tonight's program possible. And now, without further ado, I present Dr. Matthew Walker.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me in the, I believe, entirely cheap seats at the back? You can, very good. Thank you for what is one of the most delightful, wonderful, and I think prophetic introductions that I have ever had. Please do come see me, however, at the end, we need to talk. So it is a delight to be speaking to you this evening. I'm here to tell you about sleep, both the good things that happen when you get it and the alarmingly bad things that happen when you don't get enough. But before I start, allow me a quick disclaimer. It's safe to say that when most speakers look to their audience and see people who are sort of falling asleep or nodding off, it can be profoundly disheartening. However, based on the topic of this presentation, I'm going to actively encourage that kind of behavior from you, okay? In fact, knowing what I know, particularly about the relationship between sleep and memory, it's actually the greatest form of flattery for me to see people like you not being able to resist the urge to strengthen what I'm telling you by falling asleep. So please feel free just to sort of ebb and flow in and out of consciousness throughout the entire talk. I'll take absolutely no offense. Let me start with sleep and the brain. We'll get to sleep and the body a little bit later on. And here I'll begin with the functions of learning and memory. What we've discovered over the past 10 or so years is that you need sleep after learning to effectively hit the save button on those new memories so that you don't forget. But recently we've discovered that you also need sleep before learning, but now to prepare your brain, almost like a dry sponge, ready to initially soak up new information. And without sleep, those memory circuits within the brain become waterlogged and you can't absorb information. Let me show you the data. So here in this study, and I'll walk you through a series of studies now, we wanted to test the hypothesis that pulling the all-nighter was a good idea. How do you do that? Well, we took a group of healthy young adults and we assigned them to one of two experimental groups, a sleep group and a sleep deprivation group. Now, the sleep group, they're going to get a full 8 hours of shut-eye, but the sleep deprivation group, unfortunately, we're going to keep awake in the laboratory under full supervision, physiologically monitored, no naps, no caffeine. It's miserable for us and for them. It's miserable for everyone. And then the next day, we're going to place each one of those individuals inside an MRI scanner, and we're going to have them try and learn a whole list of new facts as we're taking snapshots of brain activity. And then we're going to test them to see how effective that learning has been. And that's what you're looking at here on the vertical axis, the efficiency of learning. So the higher up you are, the better you are, the more effective that learning was. And when you put these two groups head to head, what you find is a quite profound 40% deficit in the ability of the brain to make new memories without sleep. This should be frightening considering what we know is happening to sleep in our education populations right now. Just to frame this in context, it would simply be the difference between acing an exam and failing it miserably. And we've gone on to discover what's going wrong within the brain to produce these types of learning deficits. There is a structure buried deep within your brain called the hippocampus. You have one on the left and the right side. You can see it here in these sort of yellow-orange colors. Think of the hippocampus like the memory inbox of your brain. It's very good at receiving new files and holding on to them. And when you look at this structure in those people who've had a full night of sleep, what you see here in green is lots of healthy learning-related activity. Yet in those people who are sleep-deprived, we couldn't find any significant signal whatsoever. It's as though sleep deprivation had shut down your memory inbox and any new files were just being bounced. You couldn't commit new experiences to memory. And by the way, if you want to know what life is like without a functioning hippocampus, just watch the movie Memento. I'm sure some of you have seen this. If you haven't, it's a great movie, watch it, and I won't spoil the punchline, but this gentleman suffers brain damage. And from that point forward, he can no longer make any new memories. He's what we call densely amnesic. The part of his brain that was damaged was the hippocampus. It is the very same structure that sleep deprivation will attack and block your brain's capacity for new learning. That's the bad that happens when you take sleep away. Let me just come back to that control group here in green, those people that got a full 8 hours of sleep, because we can ask a very different question. What is it about the physiological quality of sleep when you do get it that actually promotes and refreshes your learning and memory ability? And by recording their sleep with electrodes placed all over the head and the face, we've discovered that there are big, powerful brainwaves that happen during the deeper stages of sleep that have riding on top of them these spectacular bursts of electrical activity. And it's the combined quality of these sleeping brainwaves acting like a file transfer mechanism at night that takes information that you've recently learned from short-term storage reservoirs and shifts it out into the more permanent long-term storage sites. It's a little bit like a USB stick and a hard drive. Sleep takes those files from the USB, makes them more safe by transferring them over, and that gives you two benefits. First, things that you learned yesterday are now protected and safe on the hard drive. But delightfully, you've cleared out that reservoir of space on your USB stick so that when you wake up the next morning, you can start acquiring new files all over again. It's this elegant symbiotic system of memory. Why is it important that we understand what in sleep is actually transacting these memory benefits? Well, there are real medical health as well as societal implications. Let me tell you just about two of these, one in the medical health domain, the other education. I'll start with medicine. One area that we've been moving this work out into is the context of aging and dementia. Why is that? Well, of course, we all know that as we get older, our learning and memory abilities start to decline. But what we've also known for many decades now is that a physiological hallmark of aging is that your sleep gets worse. And just recently we published evidence that these two things are not simply co-occurring, they are significantly interdependent. It suggests that sleep disruption is perhaps an underappreciated factor that is contributing to what we call cognitive decline in aging, and now it seems in Alzheimer's disease as well. Now, I know all of that sounds remarkably depressing. There's a potential silver lining here. Unlike many of the other factors that we know contribute to Alzheimer's disease, sleep is a potentially new treatable target. We can do something about sleep. And one way that we and others are now starting to try and explore this is by using electrical brain stimulation. I kid you not, this is not science fiction, it's science fact. It's called direct current brain stimulation. You apply electrodes either side of the front of the brain, and rather than record electrical activity, you insert a small amount of voltage into the brain. This is not One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, by the way. It's so small you don't even feel it, but it has a measurable impact on the brain. Now, in young, healthy adults, if you apply this electrical stimulation during sleep, during that deep sleep, as if you're singing in time with those sleeping brainwaves, not only do you amplify the quality of those sleeping brainwaves, but in doing so, you almost double the amount of memory benefit that you get from sleep. So the question now is whether we can translate this same affordable, portable piece of technology into older adults and those with dementia. Can we restore back some healthy quality of sleep? And in doing so, can we salvage aspects of learning and memory function? That is the real hope now for us. I should note, before you race out and start buying these devices, they are not yet FDA approved. You can buy them on the internet. I would not advise it. Just go onto YouTube and you'll see some rather unfortunate stories, people who have sort of lost vision for 2 days because they were playing around with trying to stimulate their brain. We're not there yet. There are a number of technical issues, but we hope to solve them. We really do hope to bring this technology online in the next 3 to 5 years. That's the goal. That's medical health. Now let me switch gears for a second and speak about education. because there continues to be a raging debate within this country, and in fact in many industrialized nations, regarding early school start times. And several counties in several states here in the US have started to push their school start times later for high school kids and observe what happens to their academic performance. Let me show you some data from one of the earliest test bed cases. This was out in Edina in Minnesota. It's a small township just outside of Minneapolis. And they decided to shift their school start times from 7:25 in the morning to 8:30 in the morning for high school kids. By the way, what are we doing trying to educate young minds at 7:25 in the morning? Just to sort of frame this, buses for a 7:25 start time begin at 5:30 in the morning. That means that some kids are having to wake up at 5:15 or 5 o'clock. This is lunacy. So here's what they did. They looked at SAT scores. First, they looked at the year before they made the time change, when those kids were going to school at 7:25. And here, they looked at just the top 10% performing students, those that are almost near the ceiling. So you could argue those that have the least to potentially move up, the hardest test case. And those kids, when they were going to school at 7:25 in the morning, that top 10%, they got an average score of 1,288. Now, that's a great score. The following year, that same top 10% performing students, when they were going to school at 8:30, the only thing more remarkable than the extra 43 minutes of sleep that they reported was their change in SAT score. This is what they got. 1,500. That is a 212-point increase. That is a non-trivial improvement that will change which university tier those students go to, and perhaps their life trajectory as a consequence. Something more remarkable happened in this story of later school start times, though. Something that the researchers did not anticipate. The life expectancy of the students started to increase. And you're thinking, hang on a second, how does that work? Does anybody know what the number one leading cause of death is in our teenagers? You've got both of them. Car accidents is number one, suicide is number two. When it comes to car accidents, and I will get on to suicide a little later, sleep is absolutely essential. Let me show you data from Teton County in Wyoming. They shifted their school start times for high schoolers from 7:35 to a much more biologically reasonable 8:55 in the morning. And then that subsequent year, they looked to see what was the percent reduction in road traffic accidents in this very narrow range of 16 to 18 years old. And it wasn't small. It wasn't 10%. It wasn't 50%. It was a 70% reduction in road traffic accidents. They got an hour of extra sleep. Just to think about this a little bit more, if any major automaker came out with a new safety feature that dropped accident rates in 16 to 18-year-olds by 70%, they would instantly dominate the market share. The advent of ABS technology, anti-lock braking systems in cars, that dropped accident rates by about 10 to 15%, and it was deemed a revolution. Here is a biological factor that will drop those rates by up to 70%. We need to rethink the priority and importance of sleep in education. If our goal as educators is to educate and not risk lives in the process, then we are failing our children with early school start times in the most spectacular manner. And it's for all of these reasons that I find signs like this on the side of the road particularly disturbing. It does make me wonder, how long will it be before I start seeing signs like this at the side of the road? So that's sleep For learning, memory, we've spoken about Alzheimer's and education. What else is sleep good for? Now let me tell you that sleep is essential to help stabilize your emotional and mental health. And without sleep, those emotional circuits within the brain become hyperactive and irrational. Allow me to demonstrate with a sleep-deprived subject, because it turns out that we do video diaries with our participants throughout these deprivation experiences. And you're going to meet one under the pseudonym of Jeff. Jeff has just entered the study. It's 11:30 at night on day one. He's been awake for a perfectly normal 16 hours. And let's hear from Jeff what his hopes and aspirations are for that deprivation period. I hope this is not going to be too loud.
Hello. It's about 11:27 right now. I've been here for about
Should I play it again, maybe? I think we may need to tweak it up a little bit, if possible. Let me try it again.
Hello. It's about 11:27 right now. I've been here for about I think about an hour. No. Yeah, about an hour. So it's the first hour. I'm writing my paper right now, 30-page paper. Hopefully I can get some of it done before I get too sleepy.
So that's Jeff, perfectly likable, affable chap. And if you didn't hear, he's hoping to get his 30-page report complete in the night of sleep deprivation. It's classic delusional undergraduate thinking, I have to say. I see it all of the time in my students. So now let's fast forward the clock. It's now 5:30 the following morning. Jeff has now been awake for 22 hours straight, and instantly you'll notice one of the hallmark features of sleep deprivation, which is that you slide down in your chair. Jeff's down about 5 inches here now. It's about an inch for every hour you're awake beyond 16, we've calculated. But notice how emotionally different Jeff has now become. Some people have rather unkindly described him as becoming a little bit emotionally unhinged. So let's hear from Jeff how that 30-page report has been going. And I apologize ahead of time for the profanity.
Hello. I'm very angry right now. Because I didn't get any fucking... Can I curse on this? I think I like... Whatever. You're probably doing crazy, but I'm very lucid, actually.
So you may have noticed there how Jeff went from being remarkably upset and annoyed that he'd got none of his 30-page report complete to then finding it almost hilarious. He was nearly sort of punch-drunk giddy on sleep deprivation and came right back down to baseline again. That is a remarkably abnormal emotional distance to travel within such a short time period. And I think emphasizes the type of destabilizing influence that a lack of sleep has on our emotional integrity. And we're now beginning to understand why, what is changing within the brain by way of insufficient sleep. There is a structure, a very old evolutionary structure that you can see here in red. It's called the amygdala. Again, you have one on the left side and the right side. And the amygdala is one of the areas, or a centerpiece, I should say, for the generation of emotional reactions, including negative emotional reactions. And if you look at the activity in this part of the brain in those people who've had a full 8 hours of sleep here in green, you see a nice, modest, controlled response. Yet in those people who were sleep deprived, what we found was an amplified, almost Neanderthal-like degree of reactivity, a 60% increase in sensitivity in that emotional center of the brain. It's as though without sleep, you become all emotional gas pedal and too little control brake, as it were. Perhaps more concerning, this is a neurological signature that is not dissimilar to numerous psychiatric conditions. And we're now finding that insufficient sleep and sleep disruption is intimately tied to disorders such as depression, anxiety, including PTSD, and now, tragically, suicide as well. In fact, we cannot find a single psychiatric disorder in which sleep is normal. I think sleep has a powerful story to tell us in our future understanding, in our treatment, maybe even our prevention of serious mental health illness. So that's sleep for the brain. Now let me come to the body. And here I could have chosen any one of the model systems, and the story is very similar. I could have chosen the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, the reproductive system. But here I'm going to just focus on the immune system as an example. And I'll introduce to you these delightful blue elements in this picture. These are natural killer cells. Think of natural killer cells like the Secret Service agents of your immune system. They are very good at identifying dangerous foreign elements and eliminating them. What they're doing right now is embedding themselves into a malignant, a cancerous tumor mass, and destroying it. So what you want is a virile set of these immune cells at all times. And sadly, that's exactly what you don't have if you're not sleeping enough. Let me show you the data. Here in this study, you're not going to have your sleep deprived for an entire night. We're simply going to restrict your sleep for 4 hours for one night, and then, and then look to see what % reduction in immune cell activity that you suffer. And here again, it isn't small. We see not a 20% reduction, we see a 70% reduction in natural killer cell activity. This is an alarming state of immune deficiency. And it is happening quickly, essentially after just one bad night of sleep. Imagine the state of your immune system then after weeks, if not months, of bad sleep. And it may come as no surprise that we're now finding intimate associations between short sleep duration across the lifespan and numerous forms of cancer. Cancer of the bowel, cancer of the prostate, and cancer of the breast. In fact, the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is now so strong scientifically that recently the World Health Organization decided to classify nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen. Jobs that will induce cancer because of their disruption of your sleep-wake rhythm. And unfortunately, the bad news just keeps on coming. If you are battling the fight against cancer and not getting sufficient sleep, the rate of that cancer growth will increase dramatically. Let me just speak to you about some work done not by myself, but a scientist called David Gozal, who works out at the University of Chicago. And this was featured in a documentary that I was involved in with the National Geographic Channel. It was called Sleepless in America, and it came out about a year ago. And we were able to feature some of David Gozal's work. Now, this is tricky because I'm going to show you some animal research, and I know that is hard for some of you here. So David Gozal was looking at the rate of cancer growth in mice. And they would inoculate the mice with some cancer cells just on the back, just underneath the skin surface. And then they would look to see the speed of that cancer growth across a 1-month period of time. And at the end of that month, they would resect the skin and they would examine the size of the tumor. Now, in half of those rats, they were allowed to sleep, the mice, they were allowed to sleep normally across that 1-month period. In the other half, they had their sleep disrupted for that 1 month. They weren't totally deprived, they just had their sleep restricted. So what I'll show you here is just a brief clip. It's going to begin just before I start the video. You'll see here's the background of the screen. This is a monitor, forget the wallpaper. And he's just pointing to one of the mice here with the skin resected. I know it's difficult to look at, but here is the size of the tumor growth after 1 month. This is in one of the mice that was allowed to sleep normally. When I play the video, and it lasts for just a few seconds, he's going to drag this window down and reveal behind it another window with another mouse. That mouse had the same amount of cancer inoculation, as it were, and the same gestation period of time, 1 month, except it wasn't getting sufficient sleep. It suffered from sleep disruption, and you will see the difference in the size of the tumor mass. Here's the difference. That is a 200% increase in the speed and size of cancer growth caused by insufficient sleep. And worse, the cancer had actually metastasized. That's just a fancy way of saying that it had breached the original boundaries of the tissue origin, and it had started to invade other areas, other organs, as well as bone. That is a devastating condition when it happens in cancer. So if you are fighting that battle and not getting sufficient sleep, essentially it's like spraying gasoline on an already aggressive fire. Sleep deprivation is an accelerant, and we understand it now. It produces a putrid biological fertilizer for the rampant and aggressive growth of cancer. So that old maxim that you've heard, I'll sleep when I'm dead, it's mortally unwise advice. We know that from the data now. If you adopt that mindset, you will be both dead sooner, but the quality of that now shorter life will be significantly worse. So all told, I think the evidence, in truth, it is overwhelming, and I think it is irrefutable. Sleep is the single most effective thing that you can do each and every day to reset your brain and body health. It is a basic life support system. And if you were to ask me what the future of sleep should be, ironically, I would tell you it's about a return to the past. Because in 1910, the average American adult was hitting the sweet spot of 8.25 hours of sleep a night. Now that number is closer to 6.75 hours. The decimation of sleep throughout industrialized nations is having a catastrophic impact on our health, our wellness, our education of our children, and the safety of our children. It is a silent sleep loss epidemic. I believe it's now time for us to reclaim our right to a full night of sleep without embarrassment and without that stigma of laziness. And in doing so, we may finally remember what it feels like to truly be awake during the day. And with that soapbox rant over, I will simply say thank you, good night, and after all of this information tonight, I hope you sleep well. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello? 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 Great. If you have questions, we're asking that you please come up to the mic so everyone can hear them, and we'll just kind of line up that way.
That was really fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there are many over-the-counter and prescribed sleep aids, and I'm just curious how much research has been done to the degree which those aids might inhibit the natural neurological benefits of sleep when they're allowing you to sleep, but the things that are happening while you sleep, are they preventing those things from happening? They're those inhibitors in some sense.
Yeah, so modern-day sleep medications, I would argue it's perhaps the most glaring omission in the research conversation of today when it comes to sleep. There is a bit of a stalemate. I think many of the pharmaceutical companies either don't want to report the data that they have on the sleep trials, and the National Institutes of Health don't feel it's their responsibility to fund those studies. But here's what I can tell you. The older sleep medications, they were classed as what we call the sedative hypnotics. And no one is going to argue that when you took those medications that you were awake. You weren't awake. But the term gives it away. Sedation is not sleep. And if you look at the electrical signature of sleep, which is sort of the best way I can describe it, and you compare natural sleep with, let's say, ambient-induced sleep, they are not the same. You miss some of the deepest electrical quality of sleep by way of those types of drugs. Now, I do know of one study that came out just a few years ago, and they were looking with animal research at how the brain wires itself during a learning experience. And it starts to build and make new connections. And then what they discovered is that when those animals would sleep and go into deep sleep, those connections were strengthened even more. They were strengthened by as much as experience would strengthen them during the day. Just what I was telling you, that sort of sleep and memory story. However, another set of the animals slept, but they were dosed with Ambien. And not only did they sleep longer, you would think perhaps that would mean that they got even better strengthening within those circuits within the brain. It was quite the opposite. Ambien-induced sleep actually weakened those connections by 50%, 50. And the reason that I find that data concerning is that the prescription age for these medications is continuing to come down. And it does make me worried. We need a lot more research there. And you don't necessarily need to suffer the consequences of insufficient sleep when it comes to insomnia by way of using those medications. There are now good non-pharmacological methods, particularly one called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. And what we found is that it is as efficacious as those medications that we've spoken about, Ambien, for example. But what's great is that once you stop working with a therapist, those benefits continue. Unlike Ambien, where not only do you go back to the sleep problems that you had before when you stopped taking it, but you actually get worse. It's called a sleep rebound, insomnia, that is caused by way of those medications. Now, there is a time and a place for those medications, but it's during the acute phase. It's not there for a chronic long-term sleep solution. That's not where pharmacology lies, I believe, at least not right now.
Thank you. Fascinating. Holding the amount of sleep that I get constant, I find that when I'm in the zone being productive, I wake up at 5:30 automatically. Can you comment on timing of sleep versus duration?
Yes. So it's not as though time or quantity of sleep isn't important. And I've shown you some of the extreme versions of that experiment, which is where you just take it all away. You sleep deprive them. Or you even sleep restrict them, and I showed you some of that data too. I would say probably one of the sort of great revolutions that has happened in the sleep field recently is that we've also understood that it's quality and not just quantity. And it's not one or the other, though. That's the problem, and we have to keep that in mind. It's very much like calories in a healthy diet. I could say, you need 2,000 calories a day, but if you get all of those 2,000 calories, that same quantity, 2,000, by way of just processed sugar, it's not going to be a good outcome for you. Whereas if you get those same quantitative, 2,000 calories, but by way of a sort of a healthy, balanced diet, it's a very different story. But equally, just getting, only 800 calories is not good either. So it's the same principle here. So it's quantity and quality.
Now, I'm asking whether if I get 8 hours of sleep and wake up at 5:30 a.m., is that different than I get 8 hours of sleep and wake up at 7:30?
Yes, that's another good question. And the answer is probably not for the duration that you're talking about, 5:30 to maybe 7. However, if you go to sleep at, let's say, 10 o'clock at night and wake up at 6 in the morning, versus you go to sleep at, let's say, sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, as many teenagers would like, and wake up at 10 o'clock, your sleep is not going to be the same in terms of its architecture. Why is that? It's because early in the night, your brain has a desire for lots of deep, dreamless sleep. And then as it pushes through to the second half of the night, now that ratio balance shifts over, and your sleep cycles are dominated much more by rapid eye movement, dream sleep, and very little deep non-REM sleep. It's called rapid eye movement, non-rapid eye movement sleep. So in terms of the time of night, your brain has a hunger for different things off the sleep menu. Now, for the most part, your sleep from a sort of a little bit of a wiggle room, let's say 90 minutes or 60 minutes, is going to be, give or take, largely the same. But if you really start to push that window around, you will deliberately change sleep. Now, there's nothing special about sleep after midnight, by the way. You may have heard that old tale. That's not true. Once the clock strikes midnight, something revolutionary doesn't happen within the brain in terms of sleep stages. But there is a pressure or a hunger for different types of sleep at different times of night, sort of early in the night and late in the morning. That's why if you push those things around, you can get different types of sleep. Absolutely.
Does some version of sleep date back to origins of life, or when did it become necessary?
What a wonderful question. In every species that we've studied to date, sleep appears to be present. What that means is that sleep likely evolved with life itself on this planet. Even bacteria have what looks to be an active and a passive phase of sort of behavior and, for example, metabolic rates or enzymatic activity. Now, of course, I'm not trying to argue that bacteria sleep, but already you can start to see probably the antecedents of what was sleep in the earliest forms of life. So, and that tells you something, by the way, that despite sleep being the most idiotic of things from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, you're not finding a mate, you're not gathering resources, you're not socializing, and worse still, you leave yourself vulnerable to predation on any one of those grounds, but especially all of them as a collective. There should have been a strong evolutionary pressure to select against anything that looked like sleep. But sleep has persisted, heroically so, along every step of the evolutionary pathway. If that is true, sleep must be essential at the most basic of biological levels. And that's exactly what we're finding.
I'm wondering if some people sleep on their backs, some people sleep on their sides, on their stomach, if that influences the quality of your sleep.
For the most part, when you're young and healthy, sleep position doesn't seem to make a dramatic difference. As you're starting to get older in life and sort of the body is starting to perhaps not operate quite as well as it did, one of the problems with sleeping on your back is that you lend yourself more to the disorder that is called sleep apnea or breathing-related sleep disorder. That's where the airway can't hold itself open and the sort of soft tissue starts to relax, and you start to have these periods of time where the brain gets starved of oxygen. And that's a problem both because of that oxygen starvation and it keeps you out of the deeper stages of sleep, and it just gives you this very shallow, very fragmented sleep. And that's a real problem, and it has major health implications as a consequence. So if anyone fears that they may suffer from sleep apnea, please go and see a sleep specialist. It can really take years off people's lives in terms of morbidity and mortality. So that's one of the only dangers that people will try to sort of push you away from sleeping on the back. One of the old sort of techniques for this, it's often men with sort of higher body mass index values who have sort of large circumference necks. They tend to be the people who are more predisposed to this issue. Doesn't mean that you don't see young, thin females in sleep apnea clinics too. That can happen. But here's what they used to do. They would they would ask for a T-shirt from the wife of the gentleman, a much smaller T-shirt, and it had to be a T-shirt with a pocket in it. And then at night, they would put the T-shirt on him back to front, so now the pocket's on the back, and then they would get a hockey ball and stick it in the pocket. And it's conditioning. So every time he would roll onto his back, and you'd sort of train yourself to not sleep on the back of it. Now, we have a lot better sort of medical approaches than the hockey ball, small T-shirt. I mean, and imagine, it's kind of not that I'm into, but it must be a very strange experience to sort of, walk out sort of into the bedroom now, and your wife's saying you've got this tiny little T-shirt on, and you're like, oh no, what's going on? It's a real dignity stripper. But anyway, so it's position for the most part doesn't necessarily seem to be important until we start to get into later years, especially if snoring is a known issue. Then you should be aware.
This is the opposite question. What about hypersomnia, and particularly when it's idiopathic? And then, as a side thing to that is the light cycle and how that affects both kinds of sleep.
Yeah, so let me take the last question first. There are several reasons that sleep has become problematic in industrialized nations, and the light-dark cycle is one of those. We have done away, essentially, with those classic cues of nighttime by way of dark, and that suppresses or prevents the release of a chemical called melatonin. And melatonin is something that will help you cast off from the shores of waking consciousness into sleep. We are, in that sense, then, a dark-deprived society, and as a consequence, a sleep-deprived society. And this is ever more true now that we are using bright LCD screens. That light impacts your retina immensely powerfully, and it will put the brakes on melatonin. What happens is that as dark starts to descend, melatonin starts to rise within your brain. And melatonin has been called the hormone of darkness, or the vampire hormone, not because it's sinister and it makes you grow fangs and look longingly at people's necklines. It's because it just comes out at night. And so it's an incredibly powerful cue that helps entrain your brain and your body into a down cycle to get you into sleep effectively. And in fact, iPad use, for example, at bright levels before bedtime can push that melatonin spike by as much as 90 minutes. So it's as though you're fast-forwarding yourself sort of towards Hawaii in terms of a time zone each and every night. And it's a real problem. Now, one of the issues with those bright screens is that they release a particular frequency of wavelength light. It's the low-frequency wavelength light. It's blue light. That is exactly the type of light that is most effective at putting the brakes on the melatonin that you otherwise need to rise back up. So this is one of those things that I think, so I'll be hopefully writing about this in terms of a 21st century prescription for sleep. We need to work across all levels, and technology is one of them. Right now, technology has a bad rap in terms of sleep. The invasion of technology into the bedroom is one of the problems. It causes you to be hyper alert throughout the night. It will wake people up. And it also causes what we call sleep procrastination, which is that you're sitting there in bed. You could fall asleep just fine, but you think, oh, I'll just do that one last little check of the face page. I'll do that sort of, that order. These are big problems. But it's also the light coming from the screen. You can buy or you can download pieces of software for your computer screen that towards the evening, and certainly later into the evening, it will remove that low frequency blue light from your screen. It's a bit of an odd thing, but it can really help. We need more of those types of pieces of software to help us. So it's a real problem. We are a dark deprived society. I fully believe that. The first question, which is about hypersomnia, can you actually sleep too much? It's actually very difficult if you dig into the literature to find what really does seem to be true hypersomnia. It's most frequently associated with depression. So in depression, you often get insomnia, but you can also get a subset of people with depression that describe hypersomnia. But if you actually look at the data in those studies and you start to record sleep, it actually seems more to be about a prolonged time in bed and not necessarily an elongated total amount of sleep. Now, I should note here, when it comes to morbidity and mortality, I've been telling you that the less sleep that you get, the worse things become. And that's true. So if you were to think about a mortality graph here, actually, why am I trying to draw it with my finger when I've got a pointer? If you were to sort of draw a mortality graph here, and here's your sort of risk of death going up, and you've got the amount of sleep across the horizontal axis, with more sleep to the right and less sleep to the left. Less sleep to the left. Here's what you see, as you would predict. As you go to the left and sleep starts to get short, especially shorter than 7 hours, mortality risk starts to increase, and it increases dramatically. It's not linear, it's exponential. And then you move across here and you start to think, okay, things are going to get good, and they do. But then you get this strange little huck on the other side, which is that once you get past about 9.5 hours, it starts to go back up again. How do we explain that? Well, it's interesting. If you look at the data, it seems to be that those people at that end huck were suffering some serious medical conditions. What seems to have been happening is that the brain and the body was trying to sleep itself well by responding with more sleep. It lost the battle, but it still tried. In fact, we all know this. As soon as you get sort of the flu or you get sick, what do you want to do? You just want to curl up in bed and go to sleep, because the immune system actually forces you to feel more sleepy, because it's during sleep when you get that recharge of the immune system. So it's not to say that there can't be too much of a good thing. I'll come back to diet as a good example. You know, if I give you just 500 calories during the day, if I put you into mild to moderate starvation, it's not going to be good for your mortality and morbidity. But if I put you at the other end and you start overeating, equally bad as well. There's a sweet spot for most of biology, and I think that's probably going to be true for sleep as well. The amount is different for different people. I can give you a particular figure, but in truth, it's going to vary. Somewhere between 7 to 9 hours for all human adults is what the CDC and the World Health recommends right now, World Health Organization.
And light, particularly natural light, again, the other side of it, a blast of it in the morning, is that a good thing in terms of the overall regulation?
Yeah, so this is where technology is going to come back into play. So I've been speaking to some tech companies where we need to use electric light intelligently. Thomas Edison has got a lot to answer for in that way. But we can create electric light now that as we get closer to the afternoon in the workplace, and as we get into the evening in our homes, we can start to remove that damaging low-frequency blue light. And we can help our melatonin rhythms. And then we can do the same on the opposite side, but in the inverse direction. We can give powerful blue light in the morning that will bring our melatonin levels right back down, and it will start to rouse us, and we will feel more awake as a consequence. So we can push-pull the system with technology. Technology is the problem, but I also believe it's got a part to play in terms of salvation.
Hi, I'm interested in the topics of inflammation and weight loss. I'm wondering if you can say something about the relationship between sleep and cortisol levels.
Yeah, so cortisol is frequently thought of as a stress neurochemical, and it is in part, but it can also be protective in low-dose amounts. And there is a rhythm to your cortisol that is linked to what we call your circadian 24-hour cycle, the sort of 24-hour pacemaker rhythm. And cortisol starts to drop throughout the night during sleep, and it hits its lowest level at around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and then it will start to rise back up again, almost to prepare you for the waking day. So there is a critical need for you to get sleep and drop that cortisol level and sort of keep cycling it. It's almost like hitting the refresh button. And if you don't sleep, cortisol continues to remain high, higher than it would otherwise if you're allowing yourself to sleep. I think you also mentioned sort of body mass, body weight, perhaps, and sleep. There is now a very strong link between sleep and metabolism in several ways. Firstly, your sleep helps regulate your glucose in your body. I'll tell you a quick result. If I short sleep you for 5 days, if I just give you 5 hours of sleep for 5 nights, and then I test what we call your glucose tolerance, your ability to regulate glucose, it is so impaired at that point after 5 hours of 5 nights of sleep that your GP would classify you as being pre-diabetic. Secondly, if you're trying to diet with insufficient sleep, it's somewhat useless, because about 70% of the weight comes from lean body mass, from muscle. That's exactly what you don't want. That's not what you're trying to do. So there are now very strong links. One of the other problems is that when you're not sleeping, you may have noticed that you get sort of a little bit more hungry. And here's the reason why. There are 2 appetite hormones that circulate around in your brain and the body. One is called leptin, one is called ghrelin. Leptin is the hormone that when it's in high amounts tells your brain and your body you feel satisfied with food, you don't need to eat anymore. Ghrelin is the opposite. Ghrelin makes you hungry despite eating sufficient amounts. When you're sleep deprived, they go in opposite directions. Sleep deprivation blocks the satiety signaling hormone of leptin. So you remove that otherwise sensation of feeling full, and it increases the other hormone, ghrelin, that makes you feel hungry. So you start to eat more despite being actually calorically full. And worse, what you eat is different. It's not just that you eat more of everything, you eat more of the carbohydrate-rich, sugar-simple foods. And that's why we now know, if you look at the rates of obesity across the last 60 years, they do this huck. If you look at sleep duration across the last 50 years, 60 years, it goes in exactly the opposite direction. It is a mirror image. And we now have the science that explains and brings those two things together. It's part of the obesity epidemic.
If you go to sleep, say at 10 o'clock every night, and you wake up at 4 o'clock, and you don't get out of bed until 8 or 9, so you think that you're not sleeping between 4 and 8 or 4 and 9, what effect does that have?
So first thing to note is something called sleep misperception, which is that many people, and it's actually not a joke term, it is real, your sense of how long you're awake throughout the night is usually not a particularly accurate estimate. It's usually an overestimate. It's not to say that that time in bed isn't potentially useful. You tend to have some sleep during that time, but the recommended advice is this. If you're lying in bed and you're awake and you can't get back to sleep, you should get up out of bed, go to a different room with dim, low-level light, and just do something that's not activating, like reading a magazine or a book. And only when you feel sleepy should you return to bed. And the reason is this. Your brain is an incredibly associative device. It loves to put things together in habit and association. If you start to associate the bed with being awake, it is immensely damaging to sleep. So what sort of sleep therapists will do is try to break that association, and as a consequence, make bedtime the only time that you're going to be essentially drowsy or falling asleep, and not a time when the wheels are spinning and you're awake. That tends to be the advice. Now, that's harder to do as we get older, we know, but that is the current recommendation.
And one other question, all the research that you're doing with sleep, I've worked as a volunteer in a university hospital, and the interns don't sleep for 24 hours, 36 hours. The senior doctors, if you talk to them, they say, well, we know this is bad medicine, but we had to do it when we were interns, and we're going to make them do it now that they're interns, because that's part of paying your dues to be a doctor.
Right.
So with your research, do you see where that attitude is going to change at all?
Yeah, so we have all of the data now in terms of medical residents, and it basically confirms everything that you've just said. It is hugely problematic. You will increase medical errors by threefold if you've got a resident who's had 8 hours of sleep versus 6 or 5 hours of sleep. 1 in 5 medical residents during their residency will make a grave medical mistake that is seriously impacting the patient. 1 in 20 will kill a patient because of a fatigue-related error. Worse, when that resident, let's say they've been working in the emergency room and they've pulled a 24-hour shift, when they get back in their car and start driving home, their risk for getting in a car accident is increased not by 40% or 80%, it's increased by 168%. So they then may find themselves back in that same emergency room, but now as a patient. I mean, this is idiotic. Now, we had this data is out there, and the system didn't change for the old boys mentality attitude. And you see it in the military as well. It is changing, though. And you may ask why. It's because the lawyers got involved. It wasn't because we were concerned about patient safety. We had that data and it didn't motivate the system to change. It was only when hospitals looked at the litigation and the cost of malpractice due to fatigue-related errors that people realized good sleep is good business. And it's starting to change. It is not enough. It's still not enough, but it is starting to change.
If I want to know whether or not I'm sleeping enough, is the best indication the number of hours? And if so, if I'm in a deprivation state, is there a number of days that if I have that number of hours, I can say, okay, I'm getting enough sleep now?
Yeah, so sort of how do you estimate whether you're getting enough sleep? It's a difficult question. I would say that, firstly, use your own barometer of how you're doing during the day. If you're using caffeine before 11 o'clock in the morning, it's probably likely that you're self-medicating your state of sleep deprivation. Secondly, if you didn't have an alarm clock, would you sleep longer than your alarm clock was set for? If that's true, it means that your brain still has some sleep to go, and you're not getting sufficient sleep. Regarding whether if you've undergone some kind of period of deprivation, how do you make it up? One of the frightening things that we found is that the brain is not capable of making up all of the sleep that it's lost. So doing this sort of what I would call sleep bulimia throughout the 7-day period, where you're not getting enough sleep during the week because you're sort of staying up late at night, but then you've got to wake up early for work or for school the next morning. And then at the weekend, you binge. So this real binge purge, it's like a bulimia. Thinking that that's how it works. Sleep is not like the bank. You can't accumulate a debt and then hope to pay it off at a later point in time. And you may say, well, why is that? That seems like a bad design of evolution. Here's the answer. We are the only species that deliberately deprives ourselves of sleep. As a consequence, Mother Nature has never faced the challenge in evolution of insufficient sleep. It's never had to come up with a safety net to put in place to deal with a lack of sleep. Unlike, for example, calories, we have evolved a system for food storage. They're called adipose cells, fat cells, because there was a time when we didn't have a grocery store. And we had plentiful food we would eat in abundance, and then we would know that it would have to sort of carry us through that period where food was infrequent or absent. But sleep isn't like that, because that situation has never occurred in evolution. So there is no mechanism, there is no adipose tissue or cell in your brain for sleep.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for all this great information. I've gone through these cycles of, seeing what the minimum amount of sleep I can get and go through all that and through the life I've related. But I'd like to give you my sleep pattern now and just see what your comment is. I can sleep like really solid for 3 to 4 hours, and I wake up, I'm wide awake. And I just go, sometimes in another room, it depends, and read or use an iPad or maybe a computer until I get sleepy. Then I go back and maybe sleep for another 4 hours, depending if I have to get up at 7, I might have the alarm set. But generally, I'll just sleep till the 4 hours or 3 hours or 2 hours or whatever. And then during the day, if I get tired and my brain's not functioning, I'm not sleeping or thinking clearly, I'll go take a nap for an hour or whatever during the day. If I do get tired, I'll fill it up with a nap. Getting older. Could you comment on that sleep pattern?
Yeah, so firstly, it's not unusual as we progress in age, and making no comment. Trust me, I'm right. I'm catching up with you, but it's not infrequent that you get these nighttime awakenings, and it's a little bit more difficult. One of the reasons is that the amount of sleep pressure that you build up during the day as we get older is not as strong as when we were younger. And that leads to a higher likelihood that when you wake up throughout the night, and all of us often do wake up a few times, especially when we when we end one of our dream cycles, we all wake up and then we go back to sleep. But it's so short, we never commit it to memory, so we never remember. But with age, those awakenings start to get a little bit longer, and at some point it makes it difficult to get back to sleep. So it's not necessarily something to be, alarmed of as in pathological. And doing what you're doing is exactly what the sleep field would suggest you should do, which is, go out the room, go to somewhere else. If you're sleepy, come back, sleep for as much as you can. If, however, you haven't slept enough and you're feeling sleepy during the day, napping is no problem, as long as it's not sort of after probably 3 o'clock in the afternoon. and don't take too long a nap if it's that late. And the reason is because of this, what I've called sleep pressure. And let me sort of go into that in a little bit more detail very quickly. You may say, well, what is this pressure? This pressure is chemical. From the moment that you all woke up this morning, a chemical started to build up in your brain. That chemical is called adenosine. The more of it that builds up, the more sleepy you feel. After about 16 hours of accumulation, it's sufficient enough for you to fall asleep. That's the sleep pressure that I'm talking about. Now, you can mask or block that adenosine sleep pressure signal with another chemical that sounds very like it. It's called caffeine. Caffeine rushes in and it jumps onto the receptors, the welcome sites within the brain for the adenosine, and it blocks those receptors. So now your brain is fooled into thinking, oh, I thought there was a lot of adenosine around and that I should be getting sleepy, but now it doesn't seem as though there's as much adenosine around anymore. There is. It's just that the signal is not getting through because caffeine has latched onto the receptors. But here's the problem. During that time when when caffeine is binding onto those adenosine receptors, the adenosine just keeps going. So now it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and that caffeine is starting to be broken down from your system. And then you get a caffeine crash. Why? Because your brain goes back now, once it's cleared the caffeine from your system, not only to the place of sleepiness that it was 3 or 4 hours ago, but now it goes back to the plus all of the adenosine that has continued to build up during those 3 hours when the caffeine was in your system. That's why you suffer the caffeine crash. That's why you have to keep drinking more and more to kind of sustain that wakefulness. So naps, the reason I bring that up is when you go to sleep, the brain, it's like a pressure valve on a steam cooker. It opens up and you dissipate all of that sleep pressure. You remove all of that adenosine chemical so that when you wake up in the morning, you're nice and refreshed and alert because you've taken it all away. All of that sleep pressure has been dissipated. But if you nap late in the afternoon, you've been building up that sleep pressure for 10 hours now, let's say, and then you take a nap, and it releases that valve a little bit. So you blow off some of that sleep pressure. And now when it comes time to go to bed at, let's say, 10 or 11, you don't feel as sleepy anymore because you don't have that accumulation of adenosine, of sleep pressure. That's why naps can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Yeah. But if it works for you, that's good. By the way, there's good argument to say that we are not sleeping the way that we were designed to sleep. All of us in most industrialized societies sleep in what we call a monophasic pattern, which means one single bout throughout the night. If you look at some pre-industrialized cultures, they display what we call a biphasic sleep cycle. They have about 6.5 hours at night, and then they have this sort of siesta-like behavior, a nap in the afternoon. And in fact, all of you have this hardwired into your biology by way of genetics. There is a dip, a physiological dip in your alertness around about 2 to 4 p.m. And I can measure it in all of you. That's the reason that when you get around after lunch in a sort of a meeting table, you start to get all of those sort of things going. It's not people listening to good music. They're falling prey to this it's called a postprandial dip in alertness.
Thank you. Well, related to that, if you're getting sleep in 4-hour increments instead of the 8-hour or normal, whatever, 7 to 9, do you still get the good deep sleep?
So, well, every stage of sleep is important. That's what we've now discovered. All of that dream sleep that you get sort of in the early morning hours, that's essential for things like creativity, for cardiovascular health, and emotion regulation. The deep sleep, which is what you get, the dreamless sleep, that is the sleep that you get early in the night, in the first sort of 3 or 4 hours of the night. That's critical for things like learning, memory, as well as immune function, as well as metabolic control. So every stage of sleep serves some kind of function at different times of night. So you can't shortchange it on any one of those. But your pattern is, I would suggest, not going to be too unhealthy. If you start to have highly frequent awakenings throughout the night, what we call highly fragmented sleep, that is problematic. But for the most part, if you wake up maybe a few times, then you go to a different room, then you come back, that combined sleep together with a nap will probably see you right.
The last question reminded me of something I heard recently of first sleep and second sleep
Yeah.
that was described in some societies. Well, we didn't have electric lights, and we'd go to bed earlier after dinner and sleep very well for 5 or 6 hours, wake up, feel great, do something productive, although it might be hard if you didn't have a good lantern, and then get a second sleep. And they actually referred to first sleep and second sleep. And
Yeah.
I've wondered, my question was, have you observed anything like this in your sleep lab? And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of historical cultural writings that describe a period in our existence where people did seem to have what was called a first sleep and a second sleep, which is arguably a biphasic sleep cycle, that you would have about 4 hours of sleep to begin with. Everyone would wake up, you would socialize, you would do different things, then you go back down and have another 4 hours. Now, if you look at biology and all of the different rhythms of biology, there is nothing to suggest that that's how we were designed to sleep as humans. It's not to suggest it didn't happen. It does seem to have happened. It seems to be cultural rather than biological. And so there's nothing that we see in our data where people sort of after about sort of 3 or 4 hours, they will constantly or consistently rise out of sleep and be awake for a long period of time. That almost never happens. That we should be sleeping biphasically, but a large bout at night and then a shorter bout sort of around the sort of early afternoon time, that does seem to be potentially likely, but not in this sort of split shift, first sleep, second sleep. That's probably cultural.
Hi. I am a consultant in Fortune 500 companies at the C-suite level. And there is a kind of a badge of virility thing that goes on around sleep deprivation, where honestly the majority of the executives that I work with claim that they don't need more than 6 hours, but they can get by on 4 and 5 quite easily. And this is pervasive across the industry. So I would love your commentary on that. And what's the best argument to make with these folks to convince them otherwise?
Yeah, so it's what I call the sleep machismo attitude, which is that, you know, I don't need it, I can survive on it, as if they've been able to train themselves to sort of basically do without sufficient sleep. That is a staggering level of, I think, arrogance and delusion, that you can train yourself to do away with something that evolution has spent 3.6 million years putting in place. It's probably not going to work out well for you if you adopt that attitude. Secondly, some of the evidence that I'll describe to people perhaps like that, maybe they were sort of a little bit more male than female in terms of gender. There's a variety of statistics that you can tell them too that sometimes hurt. For example, I could tell you that your testicles are going to be significantly smaller if you're, and they are, if you're getting 6 hours of sleep or less. Your testosterone levels, if you're getting 6 hours of sleep or less, are that of someone 10 years your senior. So if you'd like to beat your chest some more but get 6 hours of sleep, please go ahead, but it's probably not going to do you any good. And also, it has a massive impact on the reproductive system in both males and females. Sperm counts plummet with insufficient sleep too. So, and if you get a couple, both of which are not sleeping sufficiently, the ability to sort of bring a baby to term is very difficult, actually, if you look at the data. So that's another way that I've sort of tried to co-opt some of these people, and I've done some of those talks too, and I'd be excited to do more of them because I think it's critical. The final thing is to actually try to speak about the dollar value amount, and there is now lots of good science to demonstrate the cost of insufficient sleep in the workplace, both in terms of productivity, in days of sickness, in days of absenteeism. It's a real dollar value amount. And there's a study, for example, where if your employees are getting 6.5 hours of sleep or less, they cost you about an additional $2,000 to $3,000 a year. And you think, well, that's not that much. But if you added it up across the company, it was costing the company about $50 million a year. If you go to a board meeting and suggest that there is a problem that you can solve that would save your company $50 million in profit, the vote would be unanimous and rather immediate, I would suspect. So we can speak about it at that level, and lots of forward-looking companies are now doing this. Nike and Google both have sort of nap pods installed in their headquarters. I gave a talk at Google a while back, and they showed me proudly the shh zone. And you're sort of walking along, and all of a sudden, there are these huge plastic sort of spheres, like Pac-Man, you know, that computer game, and there's legs sticking out of them. My God. And there are these nap pods. And in fact, the nap pods came out of a company called Metro Naps. They started in the Rockefeller Center in New York. And they realized that they could get money from high-powered execs to sort of pay a lot of money for 20, 30 minutes sleep. So there is a proven dollar value when it comes to sleep in the marketplace, in the workplace. And things are starting to change. Procter & Gamble, for example, they started to, based on some recommendations, change their lighting in their companies. They also now give free sleep hygiene education to their employees. That notion of time on task, which is in part where this issue comes from, is a fallacy. It arrived in the industrial era, and even then it wasn't necessarily true. But now, profoundly untrue. That's just not the case. One of the other things I think that happens is that we, and I spoke about this a little bit at the end, we associate getting sufficient sleep with the concept of laziness. And that is a major issue. We have to get that out of society. And we don't always have that opinion. You know, nobody, for example, is going to look at an infant sleeping during the day and say, well, what a lazy baby. You know, why? Because we know that sleep at that time of life is critically essential. But here's the problem. Somewhere between infancy and now even childhood, we abandon the notion that sleep is important, and worse still, we stigmatize it with that label of laziness. We've got a real image problem in the sleep field that needs to be solved. And it's to our detriment in that way. So I think it's by way of talks, I think, in those areas that things will start to change. And I would love to try and do more of them, because that culture is a tough culture to change. The other thing, by the way, is that we all fear that sort of being busy means that we're important. So I think that's one of the other, but the main thing is just productivity. I mean, you would never try to boil a pot of water in the kitchen as quickly and efficiently as you can by putting the burner on half measure. You put it all the way up to full. That's the quickest way to boil a pot of water. So no wonder people say, well, I've got so much to do these days, that's why I can't sleep enough. My answer is, perhaps the reason it's taking you so long to do all of the things that you need to do is because you're not getting enough sleep. You're putting the burner on at 50%. No wonder it takes twice as long to boil the water.
Great analogy. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So, nightmares. Lots of it every night, forever. So I wake up very tired. I can't sleep all night. I think I'm sleeping, but I have a lot of like movies going in my head and stuff. I don't watch TV before I go to bed or do anything like that. So what is going on?
Yeah, so recurrent nightmares are not necessarily uncommon. Somewhere between about 5 to 20% of the population will have them. Sometimes it's more frequent. Sometimes it's more frequent at certain times of life than others. Some of it has to do with, of course, sort of experience, some to do with physiology and biology. There are fairly good clinical programs out there right now, people developing programs that will help try to dissipate the frequency of nightmares and restore back some sleep. So I'm certainly happy to put you in touch with some people if that would be useful. Do come and see me at the end. I should note, by the way, that dreaming or sort of difficult dreams are not uncommon. They also seem to be beneficial at times too. I spoke, Shane mentioned a little bit about one of the theories that we've been working on and showing good data for is this idea that dream-related sleep provides you with a form of overnight therapy. And it does seem to provide that. It takes those difficult emotional experiences during the day, and it sort of essentially strips away the painful, bitter rind from that memory internal orange, so to speak. It sort of divorces the emotion from the memory so that when you wake up the next day, yes, you can still remember those memories, but they are memories of an emotional event which are no longer themselves emotional. it's sort of this sort of sleep stripping away that sort of blanket of visceral emotion. And we found that in clinical groups, for example, people who've gone through difficult experience like bereavement or divorce, those people who, they often will have REM sleep, they will often dream. But those people who are dreaming around that time of the difficulty, of the things that were difficult themselves, have a better predicted clinical recovery 1 year later than those people who were dreaming, but just not dreaming of those events. So it's not just that it's about having dream sleep or about having REM sleep, which is from where dreams come from. It's also about the content of what you're dreaming, not just whether you're dreaming. So there is sort of some way to perhaps embrace those dreams and feel perhaps not so sort of challenged by them. But I also understand that they can be problematic psychologically and physiologically to sleep and sleep continuity. So I'm more than happy to sort of direct you towards some people that would probably be able to help.
My friend had a question about a glass of wine before they...
Ah, yes. So,
yeah. Good or bad?
Do I recommend alcohol? I was mortified as I walked in here. To see wine being served, and here's why. Alcohol is frequently used as a sleep aid, but alcohol, unfortunately, is also in the category of sedatives. And what you're doing is simply sedating yourself into an absence of wakefulness. You're not placing yourself into natural sleep. There are two more problems with alcohol. First, alcohol will fragment your sleep throughout the night. You will wake up many, many more times. And the problem is that you don't, again, remember those awakenings. So you wake up the next day and you feel fatigued, you feel tired, but you never put two and two together. You never realize that it was the alcohol fragmenting your sleep that was causing that exhaustion. The final problem is that alcohol is one of the best chemicals that we know of for suppressing your dream sleep. It is a very powerful chemical for blocking your dream sleep, and that comes with real consequences, and those studies have already been done. It's the reason, by the way, that if you have if your friends have a few too many drinks at night, they will say, well, sometimes they wake up the next day and say, God, I was having these really strange, really weird, kind of vivid dreams. What happens is that the alcohol is swilling around in your system, and your brain is smart. It knows how much REM sleep you should have had, dream sleep, and have not been getting. And then finally, when your liver and your kidneys have removed the alcohol out of the system late in the morning, not only do you go on to get the REM sleep that you should have had, the brain tries to get back, not only do you go on to get the REM sleep that you will normally have had, but your brain tries to get back some of the REM sleep that it had lost early in the night. It's called the REM sleep rebound effect. Now, you never get back all of that REM sleep, as we've spoken about. It tries, but it can't get it all back. But that's why you will have a more intense phase of REM sleep late in the morning if you've had a bit too much alcohol. And it can be really problematic, by the way, for alcoholics. The pressure for REM sleep, for dream sleep, because it's been suppressed by the alcoholism, gets so strong that dream sleep starts to bleed over into their waking consciousness. And they suffer psychotic features. It's called delirium tremens. They are dreaming while they're awake. The brain has just had enough, and it's going to take its REM sleep. That's how powerful it is.
Jeez.
So I guess the moral of that story is that if you want to drink, go to the pub in the morning. Then the alcohol will be out your system by the time you get to sleep in the evening, and everything will be fine. But I, of course, would never recommend that.
So my question was just any clues or examples you have about how everything you've talked about is, how any clues about how it is easier to go to sleep, or if you wake up in the middle of the night, how you go back to sleep, or just tricks.
Yeah.
No drugs, just no alcohol, just what do you do?
Yeah. Good question. Tips for better sleep. Here they come. There is essentially two categories. There's conditioning and there's environment. I know, I probably should have given you these. Let me run down very quickly. We've already spoken about these. Don't stay in bed if you're awake for longer than 20 to 30 minutes. Do what we said. Go to a different room. Avoid alcohol and caffeine. We've already covered this. Major detrimental impacts on sleep. devise some kind of a wind down time. In this modern day and age, the only time that we sort of stop and actually start to contemplate and think about life, unfortunately, is the moment when our head hits the pillow. That's a real problem. We're constantly on reception, we're never on reflection. And reflection only happens when our head sort of hits the pillow. That shouldn't be the time when those wheels start spinning. Electronic curfew, we should banish technology from the bedroom, keep it out of the bedroom. If it has to be there, put it into airplane mode, and do not put it in reach where you can look at the clock. Clock watching is a bad idea. If you have a clock, turn it around, face it away, put tape on it, do whatever you need to do. Let it wake you up. I know some of you, of course, life is sort of conformity in a way. You have to have that alarm, but at least do away with the clock face. That is a bad thing. Finally, in terms of your environment, keeping a cool bedroom. It sounds very cool at 65 degrees. Here's the reason. Your brain and body need to drop their core temperature by about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit for you to initiate sleep. That's the reason it's always easier to fall asleep in a room that's too cold than too hot. So by keeping your bedroom cool, it will help your brain and body go in the right thermal direction to initiate sleep. Next, if there is one piece of advice I could give you, it would be this: regularity. Go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time. If there is one thing you do, that would be it. And don't break that. Even perhaps if you haven't quite got the sleep that you wanted in total, the danger with sleeping longer and later is that you will then not feel tired that following night. And so now you start to drift forward. You start to then go to bed at midnight and wake up at 9, and then go to bed at 1 and wake up at 10. And so you have to keep regularity, if there's one piece that I could give you. Finally, dim lights, and we spoke about this, dim lights before bed, bright lights upon awakening. Those would be the tips for good sleep. Oh. I think we may have one more question for those, I think. Yeah.
You said something earlier about, and I didn't understand it, about coffee in the morning.
Yeah.
What? I mean, I understand no coffee at night. What was wrong with coffee in the morning?
Said like a true American. No, I'm kidding you. We Brits probably drink twice the caffeine with the tea that we drink. It's terrible. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with caffeine in the morning. The idea is simply that if you're feeling as though you need caffeine in the morning to wake up, it's usually a sign that you're medicating your state of insufficient sleep. But if you're going to take caffeine, in the morning is a good time to take it. Yeah.
Over-the-counter melatonin. Can you comment, is that good, bad, indifferent? Is it habit-forming? Should you make a habit of taking melatonin every night?
Yeah, so melatonin, what is its use as sleeping medication? Right now, it doesn't seem to be a particularly potent sleep aid if you are already in that time zone and you've been there for a good amount of time. For jet lag and for jet travel, it may actually be useful. It does seem to help sort of stabilize your sleep rhythms more quickly. But in terms of a beneficial sleep aid, once you've stabilized in a new time zone, it's not especially effective. Now, I'm not going to tell you, however, not to keep taking melatonin if it works for you. Because the placebo effect is the most reliable effect in all of pharmacology. And I'm serious. If it works for you, if you've got other sleep routines that work for you, I could suggest to you that the science doesn't back it up. But again, do not underestimate the placebo effect and what it tells you, which is there is such a thing as mind over matter. And that's a powerful thing we should wake up to, too, in medicine. Yeah.
This may be too big a question for this hour at night. Sleepwalking, sleep talking.
Yeah, so sleepwalking and sleep talking, you may imagine that they come from dream sleep and you acting out your dreams. That's not true. They come from the deeper stages of non-dreaming sleep. And what seems to happen is that there is a bolt of electrical activity that, for reasons that we don't fully understand, in your automatic nervous system. It's called your autonomic nervous system. And that spikes the brain to go from the deeper stages of sleep all the way up to wakefulness, like going from the basement to the penthouse, and it gets stuck somewhere in between, on the 13th floor, I guess. And so what happens is that if I'm recording your brain waves, it just looks like you're in deep sleep. But you're clearly about and behaving. But what you do is simply enact basic routine patterns. So you go over to the refrigerator, open it, close it, mutter some words, or sort of pick something up, put something down. And if you wake someone up out of a sleepwalking phase and say, what was going through your mind, they tend not to report anything because nothing was, because they weren't dreaming. So it's not necessarily pathological. It's far more frequent in children. It decreases in frequency as we get older. Some people, it stays with them. As long as it's not detrimental to sort of life and it's not getting in the way in terms of harm, then it's potentially not that dangerous. Yeah.
I have very interesting conversations with my daughter in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and I'm sure she will, write them down and tell you all about them. Yeah. I think
one last question. Do you know how reliable the little sleep devices are when they say you're restless or you're sleeping and you have like a million like restless things or big sleep blocks?
So those wristbands, sort of Fitbit or Jawbone, other such devices, they are right now not particularly accurate. They are somewhat accurate for total sleep time. They do a not bad estimate. What's interesting is that they are errorful, but they are consistently errorful. And second, when you look at what part of the error equation is there, whether it's too little sleep that they estimate or too much, it's usually more sleep than you're actually having, which from product, I guess, device perspective makes sense. You would probably want people to sort of feel good about the product, telling them that they're getting 7.5 rather than 6 3/4. It's probably not that in terms of that error amount. What they are miserable at doing is determining the stages of sleep, whether you're in non-rapid eye movement sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. They're just not there yet. Their algorithms don't work. Right now, you really need electrodes on the head to sort of do that. There are new ways that are coming onto the market using, for example, infrared technology, using heart rate assessment, using core body temperature. These are things that people are trying to piece together and fit into some magic algorithm that will be more accurate. I think we'll get there. And for now, in part, I'm in favor of this quantified self-revolution. If it makes people more aware of their sleep and focus on it more, I think that's a good thing. Just like the health of your heart or your blood pressure, knowledge often is no burden. It can be problematic, though. I mean, I'm a good example of this because I know something about sleep. I'm the worst person then. When I'm sitting in bed at night and I'm not falling asleep, you sort of become the Woody Allen neurotic of the sleep world. I'm thinking, well, my histamine levels aren't changing, my melatonin isn't rising, my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is not shutting off. At that moment, you're dead in the water for the next 2 hours. But for the most part, I think they're good if they bring awareness about sleep. I think for sleep time, they're not bad. For sleep stages, they're just not there yet. And with that, I think I should definitely say good night. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.